Welcome to Starbase. It's been 2 years since we had our first Mark 1 rocket, and a lot has happened since then. We're going to go through the progress, but I'm just incredibly proud of the SpaceX team and all the support that we received from Cameron County, from Brownsville, from South Padre. I know some of you in the audience. Thank you very much for your support. Before we jump into the details of what's happened over the past 2 years, I think it's worth talking a bit about why are we doing this? I mean, pretty epic, but what's the deep meaning behind this? Why build a giant reusable rocket? Why make life multiplanetary? And I think this is just an incredibly important thing for the future of life itself. There's both a defensive reason or the life insurance reason. That's one part of it, which is that there's always some chance that something could go wrong on Earth. The dinosaurs are not around anymore. So there could be some calamity where we do ourselves in, or there's a natural disaster. Now, I'm naturally an optimist, so I think the probability of that is low, but it is not zero. And eventually, the sun will expand. It might take a few 100 million years, so don't hold your breath. But eventually, the sun will expand and destroy all life. So for those who really care about not just the humans, but all the life on Earth, it is very important, essential, that over the long term, that we become a multi-planet species and ultimately even go beyond the solar system and bring life with us. And we are life's stewards, life's guardians. The creatures that we love cannot build spaceships, but we can, and we can bring them with us. And I think that's pretty important for those that care about the environment. So that's like the defensive or the life insurance reason for life collectively. But there's also an inspiring reason, which is life can't just be about solving problems. There have to be things that inspire you, that move your heart, that when you wake up in the morning, you're excited about the future. And being a multi-planet species and being a spacefaring civilization and making science fiction, not fiction forever, I think that's one of those things. That's what fires me up the most. Let's go out there and find out what this universe is all about. Are there other species out there? Maybe. I mean, we want to go find out what the heck's going on. How do we get here? What's the meaning of life? 42. But what's the question? And if we go out there and we explore the galaxy, ultimately, then we can find out some of these questions. And it would just be very exciting to do that. And something we can all look forward to. Just like with Apollo, where only a handful of people went to the moon. But in a sense, we all went there. Humanity went there. So even if somebody doesn't choose to go themselves, I think vicariously through others, they will go, they will understand, they will experience the universe. And I think that's incredibly fundamental to an exciting future. And that's why we're doing this. One of the rebuttals we'll sometimes hear is, sure, but what about all the problems on Earth? And I completely agree that the vast majority of resources should be dedicated to solving problems on Earth. Absolutely. I'd say like more than 99% of our resources should be oriented towards solving problems on Earth. So it's important to note that NASA's annual budget is only 0.36% of the federal budget. And in fact, of the national GDP, it's less than 1/10 of a percentage point. So it's like we're only spending 0.1% of our resources on space. We'll be fine. So just to make sure people don't think, is he suggesting that we just spend everything on space? No, I'm just suggesting maybe 0.5% or something like that. We'll probably be okay. And I think establishing security for life itself and having an exciting future and inspiring the kids about the future, I think it's worth it, basically. So how do we do this? How do we make life multiplanetary? What's the first step? The essential technology, the Holy Grail breakthrough that's needed, is a rapid and completely reusable rocket system. So this has never been accomplished before, and there's a lot of people for the longest time thought this was not possible. Now with Falcon 9, we've been able to show that you can have reuse of a boost stage and reuse of the fairing. So with Falcon 9, we've demonstrated a lot of reuse of the boost stage and of the fairing. We've had over 100 reflights of the booster, and I'm not sure of the fairing number, but it's a lot. That's a big step in the right direction. With Starship, we're aiming for full and rapid reusability. We obviously need to accomplish that. That's not done yet, but success is one of the possible outcomes, which I always think when embarking on an endeavor, success should be at least one of the possible outcomes. For this design, that is the case. And we're aiming for rapid reusability, which is why the booster is going to take off and then fly back to the launch tower and aspirationally land on the arms, which does sound insane, or as Bill Riley would say, audacious. If it does come in too fast and shear off the arms, then I guess it will be a farewell to arms. The dad jokes, I still have to warn you, they're only going to get worse. So I'd like to congratulate the SpaceX team and also thank NASA, the FAA, the Space Force, and all of our customers that have helped us get to this point. It's insanely hard to get a rocket to orbit, insanely difficult. I have huge respect for anyone who's gotten a rocket to orbit. It's so hard. And we've had 144 successful launches, 106 landings. These days I have to look on the internet, say, how many landings have we had? I'll have to ask the internet. 83 flight-proven launches. Although I have to say I still have launch PTSD. Every time the rocket takes off, I'm like, ah. I just see all the ways that it could fail. This year, we're actually aiming to have around 50 launches, so it's about a launch per week on average. So it's a hell of a year we got ahead of us. In terms of mass to orbit, if you look at tonnage to orbit, this bar chart really illustrates what effect a rapidly reusable rocket, especially a big one, has on total tonnage to orbit. So the total mass to orbit to date of Earth is around 15,000 tons, maybe 16,000 tons. And the mass per Starship, after a year, just 1 year of launching, if it launches 3 times a day, would be equal to all the mass to orbit of Earth to date. That's just one Starship launching 3 times a day for a year. Now, if you have 10 Starships-ish, and we'll have more than that. Our goal is to be making at least 1 stack per month, and then ultimately, potentially a ship every 3 days. There'll be more ships than there are boosters because the booster actually, even though it's gigantic, will come back in about 6 minutes. Excitement guaranteed. It only takes about 2 minutes on ascent and then about 4 minutes to return. So you'll know soon. The ship has to complete at least 1 orbit around Earth and sometimes maybe 3 orbits or more. And each orbit is 90 minutes. So the ship is probably reusable about every 6 to 8 hours. That's why we say 3 times a day for the ship. And in theory, the booster is capable of being reused every hour. So the propellant pumps are designed to fill the rocket in about half an hour. This really is designed for rapid reusability. If you can do roughly 1 million tons to Earth orbit, that's comfortably over 100,000 tons to the surface of Mars. Maybe 150,000 tons, depending on how good the landing system is. So you can only go to Mars every 2 years. And I think maybe roughly you need about 1 million tons on Mars to have a self-sustaining city. The critical threshold for Mars is to have a city that is self-sustaining. It's going to be incredibly difficult to make a self-sustaining city because if it's missing any ingredient at all, however minor that ingredient is, then if the ships from Earth stop coming for any reason, the city will die out. So the critical threshold to pass one of the most important great filters for any species is to have the other planet no longer dependent on the original planet. So I don't know exactly what that tonnage is, but I suspect it is, at least if one tries to get the right order of magnitude, about 1 million tons. Hopefully it's not more than that. Starship is capable of doing that. It's capable of getting 1 million tons to the surface of Mars and creating a self-sustaining city. And I think we should try to do that as soon as we can. The window of opportunity may be open for a long time, and I hope it is, but it may also be open for a short time. And this is the first point in the 4.5 billion year history of Earth that it has been possible. I mean, let that sink in. Or if there's a sink, let it in. 4.5 billion years. It's been a while. This is the first time it's been possible. We need to seize the opportunity and do it as quickly as possible. I mean, to be frank, civilization is feeling a little fragile these days. And like I said, I'm an optimist, but I think we got to protect the downside here and try to build that city on Mars as soon as possible and secure the future of life. And it's going to be an incredibly exciting adventure. The sales pitch for going to Mars is that it's going to be cramped, dangerous, difficult, very hard work. You might die, and that's the sales pitch. I hope you like it. So far from being some sort of escape hatch, it will be extremely difficult and dangerous and tough. Mars is a fixer-upper of a planet, so it's going to take some work to make it easy to live there. But one day we could make Mars a planet like Earth, and I think we should. So just some facts about Starship. These numbers will evolve over time. The height of the ship is about 50 meters, 164 feet, 9 meter or 30-foot diameter. Well, you can just see it, basically. It's got about 1,200 tons of propellant on the ship. Thrust is about 1,500 tons. We'll probably add more propellant over time, increase thrust. Diameter will stay the same. It's a huge pain to change diameter. So that'll tend to stay the same, but it'll probably get a little bit longer. And we're expecting payload capacity of 100 to 150 tons, depending on which orbit. So to a Starlink orbit, roughly 100 200 tons. Over time, I think we can probably get the payload for orbital refilling to about 200 tons, which is going to be very important for getting to Mars. So for getting to Mars, you also need the orbital refilling. Just like you have aerial refueling, the rockets will need orbital refilling. It's actually mostly oxygen. There's 3.5 tons of oxygen for every 1 ton of fuel. That's why it's refilling, not refueling. Heat shield. So this is the world's largest heat shield. We actually make this at our little factory in Florida near Cape Canaveral. We call it the bakery. And we're actually using a lot of techniques that are used for roofing tiles. So we need to have a heat shield that is capable of resisting extreme heat, but also is not crazy expensive. And our heat shield team has done amazing work in creating the world's largest heat shield, and one that is reusable, but also robust and low cost. So it's not a crazy money heat shield. Yeah, we need good heat shield technology for entering from orbit. Orbital refilling. We were going to do an animation of this, but it looked a bit wrong. It is a fluid transfer. Yeah, play a little Barry White, That's one of the technologies that is necessary for getting to Mars. So the ship would get to orbit with payload. And then in orbit, we'd refill the tanks so it would have enough propellant to get to Mars. Mars is far. This is essentially docking in orbit. And with Dragon docking with the space station, this is a technology that SpaceX has become quite good at. We've done a couple dozen dockings with the space station, and it's actually way harder to dock with the space station than to dock with yourself. So this is the thing we need to solve for Starship, and I'm confident that we can do this because we've done a lot of orbital docking already with Dragon. But this is going to be an important thing to demonstrate. It won't be necessary in the near term for Starlink launches, but it will be necessary for Mars and the Moon. The Super Heavy booster, it was 70 meters, but then there was an extra half barrel section that the team deleted, and totally accidentally it's 69 meters. It's also booster 4 and ship 20. I mean, this is a pure coincidence. Numbers won't leave me alone. I hope it's good luck. So propellant capacity is around 3,400 tons. I think it will increase over time, probably get to 36, maybe 3,800 tons. Thrust is around 7,600 tons. That'll probably increase too over time. Just to put this into perspective, the Saturn V was 7.5 million pounds of thrust, and Starship is 17. So it's more than twice the thrust of a Saturn V. That's the largest rocket ever to get to orbit. It's worth noting Super Heavy is the largest flying object of any kind, or will be. Yeah, very big. You can see it right there. That booster has 29 engines. The next booster, we actually increased the engine count to 33. We've kind of bounced around on engine count, because I think at one point we had like 37 engines, and then we went to 29. We finally settled on 33 engines, which is about actually the most number of engines you can actually fit under that booster without expanding the diameter. This tower from design to construction was 13 months. So it's quite an epic structure. It's really worth emphasizing that the whole launch system, which is basically stage 0, is as complex and difficult as either the booster or the ship. So I really want to emphasize that this is a very difficult thing that requires a lot of hardcore engineering. The tower and the launch system, which I call stage 0, is just as important as stage 1 and stage 2. I mean, this is really some wild stuff here. In fact, hard to believe it's real, except, it's right there. And then Raptor development, Raptor 1 was 185 tons of thrust. Raptor 2 is 230 tons of thrust, and I think over time we can get that to probably 250 tons. And it's also significantly simplified. So you can see the difference between V1 and V2. V1 looks like a Christmas tree spaghetti pile. A lot of fiddly bits. And V2 is greatly simplified while also increasing thrust at the same time. So Raptor 2 costs about half as much as Raptor 1, despite having much more thrust. And I think just generally being a much easier engine to build and a more robust engine. I'm very excited about Raptor version 2, and it's only going to get better from here. Yeah, so Raptor 2 is pretty sick. The peak thrust that we've operated Raptor 2 at this point is 247 tons. And so I'm confident that with some improvements, we can get 250 ton operating point and continue to simplify and robustify the engine. So it's really a spectacular piece of engineering. This engine has been mind-bogglingly difficult to make, but it is one of the essential keys to making Starship work. It'll be the first full flow stage combustion engine to get to orbit. Kind of need that ISP and thrust to weight. So why Starbase? Why here? We kind of needed a confluence of factors. Getting to orbit, you want to launch eastward so that you have help from Earth's rotation. So the closer you are to the equator, the more of a boost from Earth rotation that you get. So you want to be as south as possible and launch eastward. And then, it's always possible that something goes wrong. And so you want to have a good clear area. You want several miles around the launch site to be unpopulated or at least clearable. And that doesn't actually leave a lot of options. It's basically here and Cape Canaveral or Cape Kennedy are the two possibilities. And then because we had a lot of launches going out of the Cape, we didn't want to disrupt the Cape activity, the operational launches, with the advanced R&D of Starship. So it was important to decouple the operational launches from the R&D launches. That's why we're at this location. And once again, I'd just like to thank Cameron County and Brownsville South Padre and remaining residents of Boca Chica Village, where I live, by the way. It's my primary residence, is that little village over there. It's been great being here and super appreciate the support of the community. Thank you. Orbital flight is really just the beginning. We have upcoming Starship missions that will launch Starlink satellite version 2, but even more exciting than that is the NASA human spaceflight mission. We're incredibly honored that NASA has selected Starship to take astronauts back to the moon for the first time in half a century, which is kind of mind-blowing. So SpaceX is just deeply honored and appreciative that NASA would choose us for this incredibly important mission, and we'll get it done. There's also the Dear Moon mission, which is going to take artists around the moon, and that's Yusaku Miyazawa, and he's going to select a dozen artists and do a loop around the moon, which will be very exciting. And there's going to be some future announcements that I think people will be pretty fired up about. So, super exciting future ahead. There'll probably be a few bumps in the road, but we want to iron those out with satellite missions and test missions and get to a high flight rate and have something that's extremely reliable for human spaceflight. We've got a video to show what we hope will happen with launch. Let's make this real. Any questions? Let's make this real. Cool. Fire away. I can't see you, so you probably just have to yell it out or something. Yes, there's 6 Raptors on Starship, currently 3 with the vacuum nozzle, 3 sea level, and I think we'll probably end up adding another 3 vacuum engines to kind of fill in the gaps and stretch the ship. I think is going to make a lot of sense. We are building a Starship launch tower at 39A at Cape Kennedy, and we're also building a Starship production facility at the Cape, so we'll have production facility and launch site here and a production facility and launch site at the Cape as well. It's important to have redundancy.
I believe you're expecting to hear in a couple weeks about the possible finding of no significant impact from the FAA. Have you gotten any indications if that's going to come through, and what is your time frame for the orbital flight test? Thanks.
We don't have a ton of insight into where things stand with the FAA. We have gotten a rough indication that there may be an approval in March, but that's all we know.
Hi, Elon. Marcus Hervey. Can you talk about the point-to-point capability between here and Cape Canaveral?
Yeah, I guess technically yes. I mean, depending on how good things get with Starship, there are some scenarios where it might actually be the lowest cost means of transporting cargo long distances. So the interesting thing is that the capital efficiency of a rocket is much better than the capital efficiency of a plane for long distance flights. Now, this would really be more for if you're going, I don't know, a quarter or a third or halfway around the world, where if you went from, say, here to Singapore, that's a long flight. So, I mean, I don't know how long that is. I'm not sure you can even go there nonstop, but it's probably like 20 hours plus. In a rocket, it would be less than an hour. So like 45 minutes or thereabouts. That means you'd be able to use the rocket 20 times more often than an aircraft. So it's 20 times the capital efficiency. So provided the propellant cost is competitive with aircraft. And bear in mind, like I was saying, there's 3.5 tons of liquid oxygen for every 1 ton of fuel. And liquid oxygen is basically just the cost of electricity, because it's in the air, basically. There is a scenario where it's economically compelling to do long distance cargo and people transport with Starship. That'd be very cool. And I think that'd be great for getting a high flight rate and business case for supporting a lot of Starships operating. And basically, nothing's faster than an ICE EVM.
Hi, Elon. Michael Sheets with CNBC. You opened this presentation by addressing a little bit of the criticism that's been aimed at space travel being seen as a pet project, not really valuable to folks who have problems here on Earth. I was wondering if you could get a little more into the specifics on comparing not just the U.S. government spending that's happening on space travel versus other things, but maybe in terms of SpaceX itself, how you and private investment on a dollar value compares to the taxpayer-funded projects or contracts that SpaceX has won over the years.
Objectively, the cost efficiency of SpaceX is the best in history for any rocket development. And we are talking about a rocket that's more than twice the mass and thrust of a Saturn V and also designed to be fully reusable, which is obviously also much better from an environmental standpoint to have a fully reusable rocket for between 5 and 10% of Saturn V. That's pretty good. Because we need to make it work. It's not worked yet. It will work. Might be a few bumps along the road, but it'll work. I feel at this point highly confident that we'll get to orbit this year. We're making a lot of rockets, making a lot of engines. We're close to achieving a Raptor 2 every day production rate, so 7 a week, which is tough for a complex engine. I think by the end of this year, we'll be able to produce a ship and a booster per month. This is at least an order of magnitude, maybe 2 orders of magnitude more efficient than anything in the past.
SuperCluster. What does SpaceX's plan and timeline look like if the FAA ultimately decides to do a deeper environmental review of Starbase? And then one other thing, you might be able to give us an updated figure on what it costs to Starship and what it would cost a customer to buy a flight on one. Thanks.
I am optimistic that we will get approval. Objectively, I think this is not something that will be harmful to the environment. We've obviously flown the ship several times and done multiple takeoffs and landings. We've fired the engines a lot, so the reality is that it would not have a significant impact. Now, of course, that doesn't mean things don't get delayed from a regulatory standpoint, and we are in a litigious society, and so there's always lawsuits from someone, lawsuit city. Now, we do have the alternative of the Cape, and we actually applied for environmental approval for launch from the Cape a few years ago and received it. So we actually are approved from an environmental standpoint to launch from 39A. So I guess our worst case scenario is that we would be delayed for 6 to 8 months to build up the Cape launch tower and launch from there. The costs will improve significantly over time because it'll take us a moment to achieve full reusability and full and rapid reusability. We'll probably lose a few vehicles along the way. With Falcon 9, I think it took us 14 or 15 attempts to successfully land the first booster. I don't think it'll take us that many with Starship because we have that experience, but it's certainly not a sure thing that it'll work the first time. From a cost standpoint, it's a 100-ton capability to orbit. On a marginal cost to launch basis, that doesn't count fixed costs, which obviously have to be covered. It may be as little as a few $1 million per flight, maybe even as low as $1 million per flight. So these are crazy low numbers by space standards, crazy low. Now, we do have to cover fixed costs, so depending on what our launch rate is, we have to divide the fixed cost by the number of launches. So the more launches that happen, the lower the total fully considered cost per flight would be. But I'm highly confident it would be less than $10 million all in, fast forward like 2 or 3 years from now. I think it's highly likely to be everything included, less than $10 million a flight for a 100-ton to orbit capability. And 100 tons to a useful orbit, not to a low orbit. To a low orbit, it would be 150 tons. So this is ridiculously good compared to everything else. And it should be, because if aircraft were not reusable, how much would an air ticket cost? I don't know what a 787 or 777 goes for these days. I don't know, a few $100 million. If you had to spend $200 million every flight, it would be very expensive to fly somewhere. And you'd need 2 of them for the return trip. It would obviously be absurd. So if you can imagine if we were in a world where aircraft were expendable and then someone came along with a reusable aircraft, it would be an absolutely profound game changer. That's what needs to happen for life to become multiplanetary. This design, I'm confident, is capable of that. It's just a question of how long it will take to refine that and have it really dialed.
This is Andrea Leinfelder of the Houston Chronicle. When and how do you plan to test Starship refueling in space? Yeah. And aside from NASA, Dear Moon, and Starlink, can you elaborate on potential customers for Starship? Thank you.
Orbital refilling, and I want to emphasize it is refilling, not refueling, because it's 3.5 times as much oxygen than fuel. So we're mostly carrying oxygen up there. Optimistically, towards the end of next year, I'd be surprised if it's longer than 2 years for doing the refilling. And additional customers that will want to use Starship, I don't want to steal their thunder. They're going to make their announcements. But I think this will get a lot of use, a lot of attention. Once we make this work, it's an utterly profound breakthrough in access to orbit. And when you have an utterly profound breakthrough, the use cases will be hard to imagine. When aircraft first came along, aircraft were viewed as toys, a novelty, not a means of transport. They were like, oh, look, we can fly like a bird, briefly and dangerously for a few minutes. Very few people at the time thought that there would be a global aircraft industry with airports throughout the world carrying people to every part of Earth in ridiculously short periods of time. When the Wright brothers first took off, most people were just riding horses. So you're like riding a horse, see this crazy device, looks like witchcraft, and they would not have imagined that there would be tens of thousands of aircraft flying to every corner of the world. This really could be an extremely profound situation, and we really can't even imagine all the use cases at this point.
This is Steve Clark with the Brownsville Herald. Thank you for the presentation. So if the FAA does come back and say we need an EIS, does Starbase bounce back from that at some point?
It would obviously set us back for quite some time because an EIS takes a lot longer than an EA. So we would have to shift our priorities to Cape Kennedy.
And long term, what do you envision for Starbase? Like a spaceport with flights coming and going and Starship manufacturing? Or what is the future role of Starbase?
It's well suited to be our advanced R&D location where we would try out new designs and new versions of the rocket. And then I think Cape Kennedy would be our main operational launch site. Over time, we'll have floating spaceports like ocean spaceports. We got these 2 converted oil rigs that are going to be turned into orbital launch sites, and they can be moved around the world. So I think there could be quite a few of those. I think about what would really work for long distance travel. Because the rocket is quite loud, you want to be 30 miles away from a major city just so you're not disturbing people too much. So I think probably most of the launch sites long term will be ocean or sea spaceports, maybe located 20 miles, 30 miles offshore. This would allow Starship to connect any cities that are on the ocean or on the sea and have a high flight rate, but without disturbing people too much. I think people are willing to have something that's loud occasionally, but if you want to have it frequently, then it probably needs to be offshore.
Cam Gerlach with the SpaceX Reddit community. So you've talked a lot about how Raptor 2 is crucially important for Starship development and for the future of Starship. So I'm curious, what general improvements have you made with Raptor 2 to ensure it's not only more efficient and more powerful, but also much easier to produce and less expensive as well and faster? And how do you plan to continue to iterate further on the design in the future?
Raptor 2 is an almost complete redesign relative to Raptor 1. So basically everything from the turbo machinery to the chamber, nozzle, the electronics, basically everything has been redesigned. You can see the difference over there, the Raptor 1 versus Raptor 2. A lot of the changes were deleting things. We deleted a lot, consolidated a lot. The rotating machinery, especially the inducers of the turbo pumps, are a lot more robust. We converted a bunch of flanges to welds, and we're actually over time will convert even more flanges to welds. I hate flanges, especially if you've got high pressure and then cryogenic fluid or super hot gas. Flanges and seals are a nightmare. And so we've got parts of that engine that are 800 bar, 12,000 PSI, which is nutty. And so just going to welded joints instead of flanges was pretty helpful. The pre-burner controllers have been consolidated into a unified box as opposed to being all over the engine. We're getting close to the point where I think Raptor will not need shrouds. So shrouds are a huge pain in the ass, basically putting a whole shield around the engine, especially for the gimbaling engine, where it's got to have like a eyeball seal rotating in a circle with a hot gas seal. With a bit more deletion and integration, I think the engine will be flame proof, and then we can get rid of the shrouds, which would be a big mass savings. We're also operating at a higher chamber pressure. I think over time we can operate at 330 bar sustained in the main chamber without having the pre-burner pressures be too high. By losing less pressure, there's a whole pressure ladder going from the turbo pumps and pre-burners to the main chamber, and by getting rid of a bunch of the choke points, we can have less pressure loss, and so the pumps can effectively produce more pressure in the main chamber due to less loss in the secondary systems.
Chris Gebhardt with NASA Spaceflight. Can you talk a little bit about the abort modes that are available for ship if there were ever to be a problem during the climb to orbit? What would be available to the crew in that regard? And also on that same level, the life support systems for ship. Where do those stand, and what are the challenges that you're finding with just the sheer volume in Starship for that? Thank you.
Starship will not have an independent abort system, but I think something that would make sense is to have the thruster weight of the ship be enough that it could take off from the booster even if the booster has a failure at the pad level. So if you can get the thruster weight of the ship at sea level above 1, then even if something goes wrong with the booster, the ship can essentially fly away from the booster. That's something that I think would be important for carrying people and also for high-value cargo to have the ship have a thruster weight greater than 1 even at sea level. That would be the 9-engine version. And then even if you lost one engine, you should still be able to do an abort. So I think for crewed missions, we would essentially detank the ship to some degree so that you'd have launch abort capability with the ship even if you lost an engine. That would be my recommendation. From a life support standpoint, we could scale up the life support system in Dragon. That would certainly be an option. And that would work for missions that are a week or 2 weeks. That would be fine. For missions to Mars, you'd want a life support system that is renewable, essentially recycling everything in a closed loop system with close to zero loss to mass. So that would be a more advanced system because you'd have to convert the CO2 back into O2 and recycle poop and urine and stuff. So that's a harder problem, but it's not an immediate problem. We can certainly scale up Dragon for any kind of missions that are a few weeks long.
Eric Berger with Ars Technica. I'm wondering if you do get that approval from the FAA in March. I know that there's really no way of knowing, but could you talk a little bit about the hardware readiness, where you are technically? The launch tower is pretty incredible, but sort of the rocket, the ground systems, software, like if you were to get some kind of approval from the FAA in March, how quickly could the hardware be ready to go?
I think we're close to having the hardware ready to go. So right now we're tracking to have the regulatory approval and hardware readiness around the same time, basically a couple months for both.
Seth Krakowski with SpaceXport.com. You mentioned launching from the sea. Could you give us an update on the current status of using Phobos and Deimos for Starship operations?
Phobos and Deimos thus far have been a relatively low priority. We needed to make the launch site here work. This has been quite a difficult endeavor. So we deprioritized the Phobos and Deimos. Just last month, we started to take one of them and build at least a catch tower on it. And ultimately, meaning later this year, build a full launch capability on one of the platforms. Hopefully by the end of this year, we will have a launch capability at Cape Kennedy at 39A and on one of the ocean platforms as well.
Adam Cardona with CBS4 and NBC 23 here in the Rio Grande Valley. This is more of a community-based question. This past week, several BISD students, community leaders, and community members got together to ask you a question and to show their gratitude. Not sure if you got that message yet, but they were saying thank you, Elon, and they wanted to know if you would be able to attend their Charos Days festivities here in Brownsville. So on behalf of them, will you be attending Charos Days?
It sounds like fun. When is it?
I believe it starts on the 19th through the 25th. So you have several days to attend Sombrero Festival, Charos Days parades, enjoy some great food.
I will be there.
All right.
Yeah.
That's going to be hard to follow up. Hey, Elon. Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut here. A little bit more Raptor 2 talk again. Where are you at as far as production? How many do you have? How are they handling, testing? Are they more cantankerous, less cantankerous? Is that a bottleneck for the next booster as well? We assume the next booster is going to require Raptor 2. So where are you at with the production and the testing so far?
Right now, of any technical problem, I'm spending the most time personally on Raptor 2. The two things that occupy the most number of mental cycles are Raptor 2 and Tesla full self-driving. So the only remaining issue that we're aware of is melting the chamber. That thing really wants to melt. It's got on the order of a gigawatt of heat, pretty hot. Like a gigawatt's like what a nuclear power plant produces. So it really is desperately trying to melt at any point in time. We're flowing an immense amount of cryogenic fuel to cool the chamber in the channels. We have head-end film cooling, we've got throat film cooling, and we're just trying to get the exact balance between head-end film cooling and throat film cooling to not melt the chamber. I think we're pretty close. We have a couple engines in the stand that have 700 or 800 seconds of operation and several start cycles. Looking positive, but that's the remaining issue, is melting the chamber. But in the meantime, we're scaling up old production to get to 1 a day or better. So apart from melted chambers, we're doing well. We've got a lot of pumps, a lot of electronics, a lot of pre-burner controllers. So just not melting the chamber, but I think we're very close to solving that. The production system has a lot of momentum. Like I said, next week we'll probably make at least 5 or 6 Raptor 2s. And I think we'll be at 7 a week or better by next month. These are crazy numbers for rocket engines, by the way.
Robert Perlman with Space.com and CollectSpace. You mentioned the NASA contract for the human landing system. At one point, do you envision splintering off development of Starship for HLS, or how are you going to balance the timelines of rapid reusability versus NASA's own schedule of when they're ready to go to the moon?
I don't think there's really a conflict there. We're going to be making a lot of ships, a lot of boosters, obviously a lot of engines. With the booster with 33 engines and the ship with 9 engines is 42. There we go again. And that's also a total coincidence. Adding legs to land on the moon, that can be done pretty quickly. So I don't really see any conflict between achieving rapid reusability and getting to the moon. A high production rate solves many ills. So we're aiming for a high production rate.
Hi, Lauren Grush with The Verge. I'm wondering if you can clarify the number of launches that you plan to conduct in order to do these refillings. I know a lot of numbers have been thrown around, so I'm wondering if you have landed on a final number. And how quickly do you plan to launch those missions back-to-back to refuel the vehicle to get to the moon? Thanks.
The missions would happen pretty fast for refilling the vehicle to minimize boil-off of the cryogenic propellants. For the vehicle going to the moon, we would have some installation to minimize boil-off, but we'd probably be launching every few hours, aspirationally.
Kevin Haymeyer from Space Eccentric on YouTube and Rumble. My viewers are really hungry to know anything about the interior design for crewed Starship. You have HLS, you have Dear Moon, and last we heard, maybe a year or two ago, you were looking to hire Tesla employees to design the interior for Starship. How's that going?
We aren't focusing a lot on the interior quite yet. That will be important down the road, but our focus right now is just getting to orbit and proving out return of the booster and return of the ship. It's fundamentally very difficult to build a fully reusable rocket given the strength of Earth's gravity and the density of our atmosphere. Like, you can't have a lot of mass margin. So our focus is solving rapid reusability. We'll have a high production rate, so we're not dependent on full reusability, but really that's the breakthrough that's fundamentally important to change the course of human civilization to become a multi-planet species.
Bob Duncan, I'm a local resident here in the area, and first off, thank you for a very cool evening. So this has been a lot of fun for us. As a local resident, it's been exciting to watch the amazing progress that SpaceX has made here in Boca Chica. And I was just curious, we're standing on the southern tip of the state of Texas. We're a few hundred yards from your residence. Could you just speak to what, if anything, has been appealing or advantageous about operating in the state of Texas versus other parts of the country?
Something that just happens over time with societies is that rules and regulations build up, and they build up more in some places than others. And I think Texas has the right amount of rules and regulations. Thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed the evening. I think we might be able to get you closer to the rocket if you'd like. We'll get you as close as possible while still being safe. Feel free to take pictures, have a good time, and yeah, let's go like hell to have an exciting future. Thank you.